A lot of what we're doing tonight is we're finishing up this section on the Old Testament canon, and chronology. And where we left off from a couple of weeks ago, because we had our singing last week, and is we left off with some of the important manuscripts. Now, many of these we've talked about in the past, and so I don't want to really redo that. But we showed them individually, talked about several of them individually, and I just want us to be reminded in a couple of sections of history, of periods of time. And so as we're dealing with the Old Testament canon, and the manuscripts from approximately 500 BC up to about the time of the life of Christ, these are very critically important. One, because of their age. The very first one we have listed that we'll just mention now, Dead Sea Scrolls, that approximately 100 BC, but actually there's a lot of evidence that we're going to be seeing that some of those Dead Sea Scrolls that were discovered could have been as early as between 300 to 200 BC. Don't forget the time is working down. But we'll have more to say about that. As far as the Nash Papyrus, an Egyptian document, late 1st century BC, contains a good amount of the Old Testament within it. And so, again, in that which is available to us, and we've talked about that manuscript before, and we'll set this here, and get these things in order. But it was a scroll that contain 4 papyri and fragments that are acquired in Egypt in about 1898. In a class having with Annette today, and we're studying the book of Hosea, but we didn't get to Hosea. She had some questions about what we're doing here. And Annette kind of asked a question as well as made a comment in reference to the timing of the discovery of a lot of these things that, while they're very, very ancient, again, as it takes us into some BC time and early on in AD time, we know that as far as the discovery of a lot of the manuscripts and papyri really took place in the late 1800s, the early 1900s, and so the 19th century into the 20th century, a great amount. But the point that was being made is after the Industrial Revolution, we know that skepticism concerning God and religion and biblical documents was rising and getting greater and greater, and people were questioning the validity of biblical literature, especially of what we refer to as the canon of Scripture. Not just any biblical literature, that is literature about the Bible, although there are a lot of important historical documents that have great significance to us. But when it comes to the biblical documents that we have in the canon, more and more skepticism was arising. And there were a lot of schools of thought about that. 2 weeks ago, I talked about the documentary hypothesis, which had no validation whatsoever, but was trying to ascribe many of the Old Testament writings to various priests centuries and centuries after the life of Moses, which, when you talk about even the law, the Torah, in Genesis through Deuteronomy, there were those that were suggesting that none of that was written by Moses. And then there was skepticism as to the rest of the books of history, the books of Kings that chronicles the kings, what we call 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Some skepticism as to its time, as well as the prophets, not even ascribing to some of the prophets that they were the ones that wrote it, but a priesthood much later. Well, that has been pretty much discarded. And the point that I want to make, and back to Annette's comment earlier, was that I find it interesting with this rise of skepticism and this dependence upon the advancement of education, technology, and so forth. There became a greater questioning towards the Bible and its authenticity. But I think one of the greatest ironies is this. With the development of technology, that became an advantage to biblical manuscripts. Why? Why do you suppose that is? That with the advancement of technology and science, these kinds of investigation, and there becomes this great skepticism towards the Bible, and yet here is an advancement. How does that work? Why is that? I'd like for somebody to weigh in on that. What do you think is going on there? Yvonne?
I think that with the science and technology, they have found the age of these things. But the sad thing is, when they prove this, then the skeptics find something else to bring up.
Well, sure, and that's always going to be the case, because if they're going to be a skeptic because they don't want to believe it,
right,
they're always going to be looking for something. But did everybody catch the first thing that she said? And I want you to think even about, as far as when you want to speak about, most of you are familiar with carbon-14 dating, are you not? And when you and understand that carbon-14 dating, we get all upset when we hear things about saying, well, they use carbon-14 dating and they determine that some artifact or some fossil or whatever it is millions and millions or billions of years old. And we know this, that radiocarbon-14 dating really has an accuracy point to it. Now, even as I was talking with some time ago with Brother Dr. Gary Calton, who has used radiocarbon-14 dating many times in his career, he said that up to nearly 50,000 years, it's very, very accurate. Very accurate. And he said, now you get beyond that, and the more it goes, then, your possibility. But now when we're talking about biblical literature, so when they're able to administer radiocarbon dating, and specifically carbon-14 dating, they were actually able to show that the dates of many of these documents are, in fact, right on target. Right on target. And once that has become even more advanced, the old theory when it came to the Dead Sea Scrolls is that maybe at the most 100 BC, now they feel that it's even a little bit older than that because of the carbon-14 dating. Well, that's quite interesting. But then so you have two areas of fields of science that become important. And so there's that part of it. And then when we talk about more of a, what's paleontology? What is that all about? What's that a study of? What's that? No. Animal bones, fossils, like a paleontologist. And we'll deal with that, and you kind of have both, but we know that for a long time that they've also depended on that for trying to date, and some of the methods that they have for dating a lot of things, but they're able to administer two writings as well, where it has a paleontological aspect to it. I mean, that's a big word, right? Somebody says, is that a real word? It is right now. But anyway, it kind of is. Trust me, it kind of is. Just like we were talking about deuterocanonical. That's a real word too. But as you're looking at all these things, what's amazing to me with the advancement of these fields of science, the more that they have applied these, the more they're showing, again, the chronological accuracy or fine-tuning to these manuscripts. And that's really, really important. So the Nash Papyrus is a collection of these 4 papyrus fragments that were acquired again in 1898 and in the Hebrew text, and it did have within it the 10 Commandments. It had a special section dealing with Deuteronomy chapter 6, the Shema Israel, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. And so it's an important manuscript as well. And we've talked about it in the past. What I want to talk a little bit more about, though, is the Septuagint. And you have all heard this many, many times. And we assign to it, why do we call it the Septuagint? And give it even as an abbreviation, the symbol in Roman numeral 70, where it says 70 Egypt. But why is it we do that? Why is it called the Septuagint?
74.
Yeah, basically you had about 70, and evidently were like something like 74, but about 70 scholars that were involved in the translation. And what the Septuagint is a translation of what to what? I'm sorry.
Well, I would say the Old Testament.
But the Old Testament
Yeah.
Hebrew. Yeah, the Old Testament Hebrew to Koine Greek. Right. And that becomes very important too. And don't ever think that there's just one version of the Septuagint. There were several versions of the Septuagint. And understand too that we know historically who is it that really commissioned for the beginning to do a Septuagint translation. Who was that? Alexander the Great under the Grecian Empire. Indeed he did. Now, the Septuagint is interesting from a lot of standpoints, but there's some things that have to be understood about it as well. And it's really important that we see this. Now, first of all, from a New Testament standpoint of New Testament individuals, who quoted from the Septuagint on a regular basis? Jesus did. And then not only did Jesus quote from the Septuagint, but who else quoted from the Septuagint?
Satan.
I'm sorry?
Well,
Satan?
well,
He might have.
yeah,
It's not where I was wanting to go though, Tim.
yeah, well,
Yeah, but you know what? That's funny though.
when he was tempting.
Yeah, you know what? You're right. I just hadn't thought about that. And I wasn't waiting for that. I wasn't ready for that answer. Could it be Satan? I'm going to write that down. But anyway, but the apostles did. Paul did a lot. And I've made this point before. Have you ever noticed where you'll be reading the New Testament, it'll say for Isaiah says or Jeremiah, and you read it, and then you go back to your Old Testament and you read it and you say, yeah, I see it, but it's different too. Has anybody experienced that? I think most of us have. And a lot of that is a translation situation. That there are not, in many of those places, they're not quoting from the direct Hebrew text but rather from the Septuagint. Idioms can be different. Expressions can be different. We do this all the time in languages. Again, and there'll be times that we'll talk to Vicky's mom, to Mom Doris over here, who I've pointed out that since she was a little girl, she learned a dialect of one of the Swiss dialects of Ticino, Ticinese, I guess is what you would refer to that. But there'll be times they'll say, well, how do you say such and such in the dialect? And she has to think about it, and sometimes, maybe it doesn't translate easily, or she'll have these little sayings in the Swiss language, and we'll say, Mom, what does that mean? And trying to explain it and to put it in English is not always an easy thing to do, because sometimes going from one language to another language has some challenges to it. So there can be there's the variation right there. You're going from Hebrew to Greek. The Greek idioms are as such in the New Testament. They became very, very accepted. It was the language of the Roman Empire for so many years. Then here we are, 2,000 years later, speaking English, and now we've got something that was originally Hebrew, then it was put in Greek, now translated into English, and how many translations do we have and versions do we have? And then we're reading these, and we're going back, and we're saying, okay. Now, while we're not fluent in Greek and Hebrew, if we were, or at least if you went ahead and opened up an interlinear and looked at it, you'd say, wow, do that with the Hebrew interlinear. If you ever want to borrow my Hebrew interlinear, do that. And you're going to look at that, and you're going to see the interlinear with the actual Hebrew words and the English translation right below, but then, word for word, but then the translation of a particular Bible to the side below. That's what an interlinear can do. And you look at that, and you look at that, and you say, how did they get that from that? This is not an easy task. Okay? So, I want us to understand with the Septuagint, this becomes a very, very important version of the Bible that Jesus quoted from, that the apostles quoted from. And so, if Jesus and the apostles quoted from it repeatedly, what can we conclude about the version of the translation? What do you say? What do you think? Well, it has some accuracy to it. And yet, did you know that the Septuagint also has the apocryphal books in it too? It contains the Apocrypha. The 15 lost book from Esdras to clear to 2nd Maccabees of the intertestamental books. Does that create a problem? And I want you to think about that. Does everybody understand what I'm saying here? It's late, we're sleepy. Does everybody understand what I'm saying about that? That here is this version, and we do not accept the Apocrypha as canonical writings, and it should not be accepted. How can we justify the Septuagint when it does include some non-canonical writings? Or do we just accept it and go on and don't worry about it? And we can't afford to do that.
No one's ever disagreed that those writings were done in the first place.
Okay, so number one, historically, were those in fact legitimate writings, historically actual writings? Yes. So we look and say, okay. So, and don't forget, we have a Grecian ruler, Macedonian ruler, that has commissioned people to do this important Jewish literature, which includes the canonical Bible. So we look at this and say, sure, because those were some extant writings that were important to the Jewish culture. But does that mean it's necessarily inspired? No, because now, think about this, this is very logical. In all of the quotations, does Jesus quote from Isaiah and Jeremiah and many of the prophets and Moses repeatedly? I'm going to ask you right now, how many times did Jesus quote directly from the Apocrypha? Not at all. How many times did the apostles quote from the Apocrypha? Maybe once. You may remember what it is?
Oh, yeah.
Come on, Annette, you were just in the class.
It's in Jude.
It's in Jude, the book of Enoch.
Oh, Enoch.
Now, Enoch didn't write it, but he uses that as an example, and we look at it. But was Jude saying the book of Enoch was inspired? He gives it as a historical reference, but he's not quoting it as an inspired. Number one, Enoch didn't write it, and so somebody else wrote that book and referred it as the book of Enoch of some Jewish history. But don't be surprised by that. Think about this in parallel, as by way of analogy. Remember when Paul was preaching to the Athenians in Mars Hill in Acts 17? He said, "For even some of your own poets have said that we're what? The offspring of God." Now he quotes an Athenian poet. Was Paul saying that Athenian poet was inspired? No, but Paul had the right to quote him to make a point. Dennis, you and I do a lot of preaching. We quote a lot of Bible, but do we quote a lot of other folks too? Dennis comes up with some very interesting analogies and introductions to some of his sermons. I think they're fascinating. I think they're fascinating, Dennis. But a lot of those analogies you would never look at and say, now this is my proof, this is my proof, this is my text, this is my proof. No, you're just using it as an analogy with the understanding we're going to look at Scripture. Paul did the same thing. What did he say? All Cretans are liars. Well, we got to be careful who we're going to ascribe that to. Okay? He's making a point. So don't be shocked that in the Septuagint that you will find, and by the way, that in this that was discovered in the 2nd, 4th century, written much before that. When we look at the Septuagint, and it was written somewhere between in about the 3rd century, completed in the late 3rd century BC. The copies that we have available are 2nd to 4th century copies, which are quite old, and that's quite remarkable. But don't be surprised that besides Genesis through Malachi, that it also has some other Jewish literature in it as well. Which, by the way, we're going to see the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls, which there are well over 800 intact scrolls and thousands of fragments and manuscripts, are all of the Dead Sea Scrolls biblical literature? No, as I'm going to show you later on, the Copper Scroll. The Copper Scroll was an interesting scroll. It wasn't biblical literature. It was found amongst the caves of Qumran. But one of the things that was contained on the Copper Scroll was the location of deposits of gold and silver. If it indeed is the essence that they had so they had hid this away. That's interesting. Well, maybe they did it in copper, because if you're going to do deposits of gold and silver and hide away, you may want to have a scroll that's going to be a little more durable, you see, than vellum or leather, right? Kind of interesting. So the Septuagint is this very, very important document without question. We've looked at these others, but I just want us to get that while we see from 500 BC to the life of Christ that the intertestamental period of time is about 400 years, so about 400 BC. We have some things that were even done before the end of the prophetic age of the Old Testament, but in that relative period of prophetic silence from 400 BC up to the emergence of John the Baptist, there are no real prophetic writings going on at that time. But I'm talking about of prophecy and of writing prophets like books like Isaiah or like Hosea and so forth. But were there copies of things being made? Absolutely. Now, when many of them were discovered, and these what makes them so valuable, when we look at the codices, for example, the two older that are 3rd and 4th century, actually, Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, and how and where they were discovered, and then with the third one down near the bottom, the Alexandrinus, a 5th century, we understand that these are very old Greek manuscripts that do contain New Testament, but don't forget they have large sections of the Old Testament as well. And guess what? These manuscripts agree, by and large, they agree with the Septuagint. They agree with now what we have available to us in many of the papyrus and so forth, the papyri, is that they agree, and so we look at this, and if there are dates for the New Testament, particularly when you look at the Vaticanus, the Sinaiticus, and the Alexandrinus, you'll read an expression from time to time, and it will say the majority text. And the majority text is based upon the oldest Greek manuscripts that we have for the New Testament. In case you ever run into that, say, what is the majority text? The majority text is not the King James Version. The majority text has to deal with Greek manuscripts. Does that make sense to everybody? Trevor?
Yeah, obviously I've missed.
Yeah, you sure have, Trevor.
But the overall point you're making is the Septuagint, their main objective is to translate the works that they found into Koine Greek.
That's
not necessarily, even though they may be concerned about this, identify what is gospel or from inspiration. They're going to include all those works that they find and translate it.
Yeah, and that's very interesting because it's the Macedonian Empire that will eventually fall after Alexander the Great dies very young, and his kingdom goes in 4 kind of directions. 2 generals up in Syria and 2 generals down in Egypt. So you have the difference between the Ptolemies and the Syriacs up there. And it will come to an end, but that's interesting because he had commissioned, and they are going to finish that. He found it important that of this Jewish culture, and they were such prolific writers, and how important that this was that he wanted it translated into the Greek language. By the way, because the Grecian language would become the international language of the civilized world. Now, we have another reason and answer why it happened that way. And what would that be? How about God's providence and for the spreading of the gospel? I look at this, and I believe God had his hand in every bit of it. You see what I'm saying? But no, what you said is correct. It's correct. That's what they've done. But it included some other writings too. So we should not be troubled by that. Okay? Or even assume, well, then maybe the Apocrypha should belong. You know, the Catholics include the Apocrypha in the Catholic version of the Bible. But they don't accept it all as inspired. Even though they've included in their Bible, they do not accept that it's all inspired. They believe that, for the most part, it's important history. And when we deal with the pseudographical works, that's a couple of lessons away. When we deal with the pseudographical works, we'll talk a little bit more about the Apocrypha And hopefully that, but I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on that, because I promised the other elders that we're going to be done with this. I've already given a date when we're going to be done with it, but I'm not going to tell you what it is. But I'm going to hold to it. I really am. Okay, what I wanted to show you, by the way, is just we've seen some of these. Oh, in the Latin Vulgate. Oh, the Ethiopic version, by the way, Ethiopian, very, very important. In fact, I think that's the one that Brian Williams here a couple weeks ago, he said, Brent, have you seen this information? And it was about the Ethiopic version, and I had. And don't forget, too, that how widespread Christianity become in Ethiopia. And that's very interesting, too, because who probably could have very well taken the gospel to Ethiopia at first? How about the Ethiopian eunuch? Because as he was converted in Acts 8, and he went on his way rejoicing, right? He went back to Ethiopia, and we know that there became a very, in time, very, very, very large segment of Christians and important documents in Ethiopia as well. The Latin Vulgate with Jerome in 405 AD, we understand, but again, the Latin Vulgate, you're going from Hebrew and Greek to Latin, and furthermore, Jerome was dealing with the best manuscripts that he had at the time. Some of these manuscripts, you see, he did, even though these were old manuscripts, he didn't have access to the Vatican, Sinaiticus, and Alexandrinus. Okay? He's using some other texts that were probably very, really more in his day, but not those particular texts. And I spent a whole session on the Syriac versions about a month ago, and the Peshitta and so forth. Just to show you just a couple, we're going to talk about Dead Sea Scrolls, the Nash Papyrus, a great example of that. And these are just some photos of these different pieces that we have. And so understand that the Dead Sea Scrolls, for the most part, are in Hebrew and Aramaic. The Nash Papyrus is in Hebrew. The Septuagint, don't forget, that is Greek, but it's an uncial. If you notice, those are all capitals, or maybe you don't notice, but they are all capitals. And then the Chester Beatty, and we've talked about the Vaticanus, another uncial, the capital Greek letters, and then a newer copy, but of the Peshitta. Finally, when we come to the latter manuscripts that have great significance, even though they're newer. They're newer, so when I take latter, I'm talking about newer, and from the 9th to the 11th centuries. And they're in the material that you have, and the one I really wanted to talk about is the Masoretic text. And you look at that date, and it was done in just at the turn of the century. The work was begun in the 800s and completed about the turn of the century. But this is so valuable, the Masoretic text, because the Masoretes took the Old Testament, the Hebrew, and the Masoretes assigned vowels. Now, why do I say that? What fact do we know about the Hebrew language, the Hebrew alphabet? That it has what and doesn't have what? Yeah, it's a consonantal language, all consonants. And it doesn't have vowels. They are articulated by virtue of just learning it, but vowels are not written. As we have A, E, I, O, and U, and sometimes Y, but Hebrew does not have vowels. I probably should have given some examples of that. But it's basically, it is a consonantal language, and there are normally root words start with 3 Hebrew letters. But depending on how you pronounce vowels between consonants, because it's kind of like playing Wheel of Fortune. Sometimes you just got to buy a vowel, right? And the difference between Melech and Malakah, well, it's the difference between king and queen. But the 3 letters are indeed a mem, a lamed, and a kof. Melech, just think of MLK like Martin Luther King. It's an MLK, but depending on how you pronounce it in between is the difference between a king and a queen. So what the Masoretes did, when they came up with the Masoretic text based on old manuscripts, so it's not a bad translation. And understand, when you're talking about the King James Version, when you're talking about many of the early English translations, they depended heavily upon the Masoretic text. Now, they created vowel points. So when you look at the Hebrew language, you just have all of this, it looks hieroglyphic, right? They're funny looking letters. But then when you look in modern Hebrew and in textbooks and in reference books, you see these points, these dots, you see these lines, you see these diacritical markings. The Masoretes developed that, and it helps non-Hebrew speaking people to be able to look at and pronounce these words. When I teach basic introductory Hebrew to the guys in the program here, I teach them the vowel point system as well, so that when they read interlinears, they're able to read that, okay? But it's a very important text, the Masoretic text. You'll find that the Codex, the Codex of Leningrad, I've got, you have two different ones up there, but and I'm trying to think the one, because there's another copy. Oh, it's the Codex of Leningrad that is going to include other things besides the Old Testament. But the Codex of Leningrad, Old Testament in 1008. But there was a time of the older Codex that it was the oldest copy of an Old Testament that we had, and until the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then we didn't have to depend upon it so much. And the Damascus Pentateuch, 10th and 11th century. But I just want us to be familiar. So when we say Samaritan Pentateuch and Damascus Pentateuch, we're talking about different languages in translating, because what's the Pentateuch? First 5 books of the Old Testament. Okay. And so the Penta, meaning 5 there in that case. And by the way, the difference between Penta and Pentecost, because the day of Pentecost is P-E-N-T-E, and what does Pente mean? 50, where Penta is 5. But those are sometimes confused. So I just wanted to show some of these nice examples of that, of a couple of things that we have. Don't forget, they're much later, they're newer, and even the system or type of printing, look how more sophisticated it's becoming, in columns and in print and so forth. And when did Gutenberg come on the scene for you history majors? What was that? 1400. In the 1400s, okay, yeah. I knew it was right around that, but I couldn't remember the exact date. But anyway, so when you think about the advancement of the printing press and what that did, that's quite amazing. Now, oh good, I got 9 minutes, because we want to spend a little bit of time here. Questions or comments?
Brent, on the Septuagint, it was interesting that was translated during the silent period, as far as Christians go. It was around 300 BC.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Again, because what they did is they took the extant Hebrew Bible that had been around, like the Torah had been around since Moses. And then as you got the age of the prophets going along, that by that time, you see Old Testament literature, God's word for the Old Testament, was complete. Now, I don't know that the Grecian authorities, I doubt that they looked at that and said, okay, this is the time to do it because Jewish prophecy is done with. They wouldn't even know that. They'd probably even think about that. Again, that's how I look at it as very, very providential, that it was the time of prophetic silence. Now, they take it and translate it into Koine Greek. Yeah, that's a good point. Anybody else? Anything else? Okay. When it comes to the Dead Sea Scrolls, we just cannot say enough about it. And there's pages and pages, and this is size 8 font. So, I have to put my bifocals on when I'm going through this. And just a little bit of background, we have a lot of time. We're going to spend a couple weeks on this tonight, next week for sure. But as we look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, first of all, let me just see a show of hands. How many of you are somewhat, everybody's heard of them, but how many of you are somewhat familiar with what's going on with the Dead Sea Scrolls? Okay. Really, maybe only about half of you, or a little better than half, I suppose. And some of you are maybe just being bashful. And when we look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, obviously, geographically, where are we talking about? How about the Dead Sea? Like who's buried in Grant's tomb? Okay? So when we're talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, the reason is that because from some of these caves, one could stand there and look out upon the Dead Sea. And so the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, so if you'll notice here, again, see, as you can see where there's these caves, and I just gave an example. This may be a part of the Isaiah scroll itself. But you have these caves, and there are actually probably dozens and dozens and dozens of caves in this area that was known as what? What's the area known as, geographically? Besides the Dead Sea, there's a specific name. There it is, Qumran. These are the caves of Qumran. Does anybody know how many caves there were where all of these scrolls and manuscripts and fragments were found? How many caves were there? 11. And that exactly, there were 11. And a Bedouin shepherd discovered these. Now let's think about this land. What would you say about the climate of this Dead Sea area? Arid. I mean, we're not talking semi-arid, we're talking arid. Very arid. And furthermore, it's arid, but the scrolls were placed within what? Jars. Clay vessels or jars. Most of them originally having even lids on top. Put inside the caves, arid climate, not exposed to sunlight, protected in many different ways. And here, these caves and these scrolls were discovered for the first time in what year? 1947. 5 minutes. 1947. One tradition says that the shepherd had his son with him, and his son, and this is a traditional thing, I don't know if it's really valid, but it makes for a great story, but that the shepherd's boy was throwing rocks up, and he saw these caves, and he's heaving these rocks, and a rock went in, and he kind of heard a clink that was not like a thud, and so crawled up there and found, even in the first cave that was discovered, an unbelievable amount of pots. Some completely intact, some broken, but scrolls. And they began to look around in all of these caves. And in 11 caves, there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of scrolls and pots intact. Again, some broken. And so when we look at this time period, in fact, there is, I was going to show where it's standing inside one of the caves and looking out, and that's the Dead Sea right there. Okay? And of course, do you see these are people scaling the side here? And they're heading for that. And this group, by the way, even December 13, 2001, by the way, they put a date on that picture. But these, what are known as the caves of Qumran. Okay? Now, the expedition, while it was discovered in 1947, the expedition lasted for how many years? Does anybody know? Of actually discovering these, searching these caves, and the beginning to sort them and getting ready for very careful examinations. But basically, how long did that last? 9 years, exactly, Tim. Was it written in the material in there? I hardly even read that. You know what? I hardly even read. That's in the material handed out?
Yeah.
Okay, that's what we just handed out, right? Okay. Yeah, I guess I ought to look at that. But anyway, but from 1947 to 1956, and the work that was done was meticulous. We'll talk about next week, because what becomes important is once these are discovered, and then it's understood that there's a lot of different kinds of information on these that are primarily written in Hebrew, and there's some Aramaic. And by the way, a little Greek here and there too. But primarily Hebrew, And as they start reading the Hebrew and they see that it is a biblical style of Hebrew, that it does contain a lot of biblical literature, of books of the Bible specifically, and then commentaries on the book of the Bible. One of the greatest discoveries was called the commentary of Habakkuk. And that's one of the first things that Vicki and I got to see when we went and saw the Dead Sea Scrolls, was the commentary of Habakkuk, as well as the Isaiah scroll, but the commentary of Habakkuk. But here's the thing that I want you to think about as we got 1 minute left. These are discovered, and they're discovered in this area, and what do you think is going to become the big debate? Exactly. And we know what's going to be debated is who's going to translate and who's going to do the work. But man, we're talking about possession. When we understand historically that this is one of the greatest and has been deemed as the greatest historical discovery of the 20th century, who's it going to belong to? Well, we'll talk about that next week. Okay? And so we have a lot I want to show. I've got several slides to show and information to go over in reference to the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so you only have a couple of pages there. We're going to cover that material, but I have slides and a bunch of other material that I want to go over as well. Okay? We'll just keep working at this, everybody, so that we are developing. Oh, I'm going to close with this too. Have everybody come in. I see the kids out there. I was talking to Debbie Cugini today, and Debbie says, you know, Brent, one of the things that you ought to think about doing is when you're all done with this class in a couple of years, I think is what she said, but it's not going to be that at all. But she says, write down some of what you think are the most salient features that we can in 15 minutes share with our neighbor. I said, that's easier said than done. But I started looking at some stuff I've done in the past and some other literature I had, and I think I'm going to put something together. It may not be 15, but it'd be 30 minutes, easy. That at least some highlighted points that will help to show why we believe that the Bible is authentic. Maybe you'd like to have something like that? Okay. You can thank Debbie Cugini for that. All right? Okay. Thank you very much.